Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Achille Mbembe, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you to the second day of our 2023 Conversations, South Africa. We do have those who are present in this room and many who are following us virtually. The theme of the first symposium this afternoon is co-production in the Anthropocene, views from the South. We hope to build on the map Sheila generously shared with us last night, and from there move on to examine a whole set of issues from various profiles we have on this panel. The first to speak will be Sheila, of course. She will be followed by Lesley Green from the University of Cape Town. Then Dilip Menon from the Department of International Relations at Wits will speak. And he will be followed by Alf Nilsen, who is the director of the Center for Asian Studies in Africa at the University of Pretoria. So without further ado, I would like to invite Sheila to share her thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Achille, for hosting this afternoon's conversation and also for the overall design of these extremely rich few days. I'm privileged to be with you all here this afternoon, but also to be in South Africa again and in Johannesburg for the first time. So thank you for all of those experiences. So I want to begin the conversation about co-production and the Anthropocene by first saying a few words about what this term co-production has come to mean in my field of science and technology studies, because like many words that exist out in the world, but also in a disciplinary context, it has a particular history and a particular meaning. And I think that meaning is especially significant for those of us who are working on environmental matters to any degree, because co-production bridges a set of divides that are often kept separate for analytic purposes. Most importantly, the divide between what we take to lie in the domain of facts and what we relegate to the domain of values. So this is a kind of separation that's been foundational to particularly Western intellectual culture for many hundreds of years, that there is one way of representing how the world is, and that's just to be taken for granted because it's a representation of what the world is like. And then what we choose to do about that world is something else again, and that is a matter for preference, for values, for things like politics, ethics, all of the kinds of should questions and ought questions of the world. But that the is questions, is what is the temperature like today? Is climate change happening or not? Is it anthropogenic? Is it owing to human causes and human behavior? That these all lie on the factual side of the boundary, and there are answers that we must all accept because factual answers are by their nature not contestable, and they're the same regardless where one sits and how one looks at things. So that separation between fact and value, between nature and culture, between is and should, is and ought, these things are taken as so foundational that to challenge them really implies a very different way of thinking about the world, almost a revolutionarily different way of thinking about the world. So STS is just one of several fields in the more theoretical, more critical, more interpretive social sciences and humanities that has taken this challenge on board and says, look, the challenge for today's world and thinking about what Achille referred to as planetary sustainability yesterday in yesterday's conversation, that requires an overthrowing or a transcending of certain kinds of fixed ways of thought that we've not bothered to question before. And I think once one starts thinking in this way, if one adopts a critical and interpretive stance, one that asks us to think not only what we're seeing, but why we think we're seeing it in that way, one is led into territories of thought and action that I think are more productive for the kind of predicament in which we find ourselves today as a planetary society, but also as a global society that still remains structured at many other levels of action, of disciplines, of political affiliations, and of commitments and preferences as well. So the term Anthropocene, I suppose it's relevant in a way for a new term to come to being at the millennium, but it's often dated to the year 2000 when a Nobel laureate named Paul Crutzen introduced that term into regular environmental discourse by saying, we have entered a new age, an age we should be thinking about differently because it owes its being to the ways in which human beings as a species have been living on the planet, that we have caused an enormous acceleration in different kinds of environmental phenomena such that you can take something like the last 50 years as marking a different geological epoch from any other eras that have come before. And this epoch is marked by physical traces of the ways in which we behave as human beings on the planet. So, for example, the rise in radioactivity that can be atmospheric radioactivity that can be dated back to nuclear tests that we conducted and that then released a degree of radioactivity into the air that didn't exist before, or take any other products of normal industrial civilization, such as the rise of plastic detritus in the oceans or the deposit of cement all over the world's surface, and you find in all of these kinds of uses of the earth, extractions from the earth, a kind of exponential rise that mark, it's possible to think of the visitor to our planet in some very distant future who will be doing the archaeology of this period, and they will find that the strata of geology look different because of the way we have lived on the earth. And there's been a lot of scientific debate about what should we take as the markers, how do we date things. If you're making geologic claims are essentially historical claims. The historical claims about when certain marked changes happened in the way in which the physical phenomena and the biological phenomena of life interact together on the planet. So the argument of the people, the anthropocenists, you could call them, is that when the visitor from a distant planet or from a distant civilization comes and tries to study our period, they will find markers showing that humans have altered the earth irrevocably. Well, the STS contention, I think the contention of the critical social sciences and humanities is that if you radically change the way we think about the world, you are also at one and the same time calling attention to ways in which we ought to live on that world. So to take a very simple point, if we're now saying that there is a universal way of dating geological strata such that human activity matters, we're almost at the same time calling into existence a thing called humanity that is now to be held responsible for this shift. Well, that in turn implies that people have to be willing to say, okay, guys, we're part of humanity and not all divided up into our particular interests. And therefore, it's not surprising that the very moment in which geologists, but also many other natural scientists, have begun to talk about the Anthropocene as a distinctive phenomenon and a distinctive place in nature, critical theorists have come and said, what are you erasing by introducing this new term? And the very shorthand answer to what are you erasing is the word responsibility. If human activity has caused a set of deep-going, systemic changes in planetary ways of life, such that it's actually a marker of a new era, who is responsible for those changes? And what if those changes are not for the good? What if they're resulting, for example, in a disturbance and disruption of the climate system that is threatening to all of humanity writ large? Is everybody responsible to the same degree? Because we're all part of the human species. And people have started coining different terms, of which one of the most resonant is capitalocene, by saying, the term implies that when you say Anthropocene, you're holding everybody in humanity equally responsible. It's us as anthropos that are responsible. Capitalocene is a critical term that says, sorry, no. It's forms of capitalism that are responsible for particular patterns of extraction, particular distributions of risks and benefits in this new era around the planet. So I think that it behooves us as scholars of phenomena like globalism, like international relations, like climate change for that matter, to take these questions extremely seriously on board. What is the structure of responsibilities that are changing as a result of our giving a scientific name to this new era? In my own work, and I'll just conclude by saying a couple of things about that very quickly, I'm interested in the ways in which the introduction of a new scientific concept changes us in our subjectivities and our understanding of who we are as human beings, changes us in our affiliations with other people. What communities are we part of, and what communities are we no longer part of? Where are we citizens? Where do we have responsibility to act? And last but not least, the temporal and spatial scale at which responsibility now operates. So yesterday we talked a little bit about sustainability. I'm sure that word will be on the table again today. But sustainability is a term in environmentalism that has no temporal limits at all, because it makes us responsible for future generations. It doesn't say how many future generations. It's open-ended. Politics, as we know, is not open-ended, and so it is a radical shift to say that we're now entering this no-holds-barred spatial and temporal zone that is captured in the word Anthropocene.
Thank you very much, Sheila. I now ask Lesley to follow on your footsteps.
Difficult footsteps to follow. Lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation and your hospitality. I put together a couple of slides based on my recent trip to Kenya to the African Climate Summit, which was held in September, where my hosts were, in fact, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, who really exemplify the struggle of non-state actors to contest the almost incontestable global discourses of and sets of logics and ideas around what sustainability means, and how the planet is to be managed. And the key questions that were being asked by peasant farmers from Zambia, by pastoralists from Somalia, by a professor from Khartoum University, this extraordinary gathering of people to talk about adaptation to climate on whose terms, with what concepts. Are we going to settle for patented seeds that criminalize farmers when the wind blows the pollen? Are we going to settle for privatized water? Are we going to settle for the globalized flower farms that exist close to airports in Nairobi and Addis Ababa that export flowers but mean that local farmers don't have enough water, and so on? And so the questions that arose in that were fascinating, because the set of questions was asking, how do we actually contest this global hegemonic discourse about what sustainability is? So this diagram actually comes from the International Panel of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And it's a classic model of what sustainability looks like in ecosystem services and social ecological systems thinking. And what's interesting about this model is not just its machinic structure, but that it was an attempt to engage with different approaches, with ideas from the global south. So you'll see in black the science view, good quality of life, nature's benefits to people, anthropogenic assets, nature, drivers, natural drivers, anthropogenic drivers, and so on. Then in green, you see a set of words like human well-being, ecosystem goods and services, biodiversity and ecosystems, which is kind of the sustainability lingo, the hegemonic ideas. And then in blue, there was an attempt to engage with indigenous dialogues, like living in harmony with nature, harmony with Mother Earth, nature's gifts, Mother Earth, systems of life. And what's interesting to me about this dialogue as an artifact of the sustainability discourses is the unresolved differences between what's in green, what's in black, and what's in blue. But hold on to the machinic structure that's given there. Now, Bernard Stiegler is an extraordinary scholar. His book, The Nig Anthropocene, has an extraordinary chapter in it where he talks about the shift to instruments of calculation within Anthropocene discourses. And his argument in that book is that the ways in which calculative sciences have emerged in sustainability discourses are not able to address the Anthropocene, but in fact produce what he calls the Anthropocene, maximum disorder. They're not able to address the difficulties, and he talks about this. I've highlighted in yellow, this capital episteme, where every instrument of calculation is functionally integrated as instruments of statistics, measurements, simulation, modeling, observation, production, etc. And he talks about this as an absolute non-knowledge because it has no values. It's the dissolution of knowledge into nihilism, he argues. And our challenge is to work out how do we respond to this computational reticular capitalism that appears to be incapable of engaging different forms of knowledge. So, for example, in the social ecological systems approaches and ecosystem services ideas, there's a couple of key ideas that are almost immovable in these global fora and global dialogues. First is the idea of ecosystem services, which I recognize was an attempt by scientists 15 years ago to do diplomacy, to try to when in Rome, speak as the Romans do, to try to say to global capitalism, this nature that you're destroying has financial value. Can you not see that? I recognize that it was an attempt at diplomacy. But over the past 15 years, this has shifted into the assumption that Earth systems run on dollar values, where patently they don't. The second concept, social systems, is rampant in this discourse. My question to many of my dear colleagues in the natural sciences who are involved in environmental governance is, where is this social system that you're talking about? Show me empirically a social system. And they'll point to documents and policies and laws or policing. My answer is, when did you last pay a traffic fine? Thirdly, that this idea that nature exists behind fences, it maintains the nature-society divide and produces the equivalent of the Bantustan in the Naturestan, the conservation space in which everything has to be pristine and pure, which in turn makes possible the destruction elsewhere. Another concept that is enormously difficult is behavior change. This idea of the green nudge, where we'll, give financial incentives for people to behave differently. The commodification of nature, and very importantly, corporate science. The commercialization of science means that we are dealing with science for sale. And if you want to look that up, look at the record of a company called Eurofins that's got 800 branches internationally that does science for corporates and for governance, including the city of Cape Town, in its work on its contestation of the contamination of the oceans through sewage pollution. And Eurofins has paid something like $28 million in court-imposed fines for bribery and corruption in relation to sciences done for the fracking industry and various food industries and so on. Bearing in mind this financialization and corporatization of science as a critical element of oligarchy. We can look at carbon accounting and the role that carbon accounting is making in fostering a global climate apartheid. 3 points. Polluters pay Africans or colleagues in organizations in governments in the global south not to sell their carbon sinks. In other words, if you've got a forest that you're not using, it's a carbon sink, the polluter can pay. But then those African countries cannot use that carbon sink in their own nationally determined contributions to global climate carbon negotiations. Those are sold. Secondly, there's debt swap, which I think is an invidious invention. We'll have colonial debt forgiveness in exchange for you putting money into climate adaptation. My question is, what would Cabral say? I steal your house, then I bill you for it, and I'll say, I won't bill you for your house anymore if you fix everything up. And what I saw very strongly in Kenya was the rise of corporate technoscience, particularly in the ways in which the big global accounting firms, many of which have got such bad names in this country, are now increasingly taking on the work of carbon accounting. It's the new form of carbon accounting. So with these kinds of things, what happens is that Africa carries a disproportionate responsibility for remediating the planetary emergency. So with these observations, what can we do about them? Is there a possibility of a constitutional turn for North-South climate negotiations? And I have to thank Sheila for her extraordinary work on these issues. The place that the students I work with and I begin is with Aimé Césaire's Notebook of Return to My Native Land. Just a quick paragraph from that extraordinary epic. He writes about a town that is incapable of growing according to the juice of this earth, encumbered, clipped, reduced, in breach of its fauna and flora. It's an extraordinary paragraph, and a stanza, and it speaks so clearly to what our comrades and allies in the Pan-African climate justice movement are working with. They're working with cities that are being governed in ways that don't attend to the material flows of the earth, which in turn harm health and harm people. So, they're up against concepts of earthly flows, not Césaire is trying to speak about earthly flows instead of dollar values in the contemporary thing. This town that he's speaking about lives in relation to the flows and the metabolism of the earth around it. But the colonial modernist paradigm doesn't allow that. And what this epic, which I think should be required reading in every undergraduate curriculum, is he's showing how nature and society are one. Damaged landscapes mean damaged bodies. And this material flows, and I think, to me, Césaire's work really provides an extraordinary leadership for us in rethinking from the global south, what does a post-colonial, decolonial environmentalism look like? I've got a few seconds left. Some of the work we've been doing with my colleagues and students back in Cape Town is thinking with Ubuntu in African environmentalism. A couple of key points. This idea of kinship with soil, sons and daughters of soil, where past, present, and future generations are connected in the soil. This idea that the nature is made of relationships, not objects. And the human is not Homo economicus, but perhaps we could rather replace it with the concept of Homo sedimenta. So to conclude, Daraja Press's motto in Kenya is a phrase that I love: nurture reflection, shelter hope, inspire audacity. And for me, that's where the social sciences need to be going right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lesley. Those who were here last night can see the ways in which, some of the reflections shared as they are flowing into this afternoon's session. I'm calling on now on Professor Dilip to share his own thoughts with us.
Thank you very much. Some of you were present here yesterday when Professor Jasanoff gave us that magisterial wide-range talk on artificial intelligence in our times. And I'd just like to return to 3 images that she used in the course of her presentation, and then have 2 observations to make. The first was this idea, the image that she put before us of the triumphal narrative of artificial intelligence, the image of the ape to man transition that we are used to. So you had the kind of clumsy walk of C-3PO moving to the kind of robot swaggering with the style of Johnny Depp. I mean, there's a kind of progress there of the robot, but central to this development of artificial intelligence is also perhaps the idea of failure. And this is something that the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, along with Netta Alexander, has written about, that central to the capitalism and the science of our contemporary times is the idea of failure, so that when you have venture capitalism, innovation, you work with the idea that certain plans will fail, certain ideas will fail, and this is central to the concept of progress. So in many senses, Beckett has been resuscitated as the patron saint of our contemporary times, this meme that you see all over the internet now, fail again, fail better, right? Which is really the credo for the Anthropocene period. And of course, this comes from his short story with a dreadful pun as a title, Worst Word Ho. The second question that Sheila raised was the question of agency and the question of responsibility. So, for example, if you have the Google car and the Google car crashes into somebody, do you hold the car responsible? I mean, so what do you do with non-human agents and the question of their responsibility? And I was immediately reminded of some of these discussions that happened in early modern Europe, where the early modern church accorded punishment to insects, like the boll weevil, which had destroyed crops. So boll weevils would be summoned before the ecclesiastical court to be given punishment, and then the lawyers would make the case that they are creatures of God, like us, and that they should be given, let off, and so on. So Luke Ferry writes about this in the New Ecological Order. And interestingly, till the 19th century, late 19th century, in Britain, animals could be criminally prosecuted for attacking their masters. So this question of this transition is something that we need to think about with regard to responsibility, where what is the paradigm for dealing with non-human intelligence and responsibility, right? And in many senses, insects were wrapped into the idea of the human and the great chain of being. Is something similar possible with artificial intelligence and robots? The question of sentience is central. The third issue that she spoke about, which had a rather despondent-looking man, was the question of forgetting, and that we are in an age where forgetting is no longer possible because everything is up there on the internet. And Sheila showed us a slide of Mr. Gonzalez, who was suing Google for maintaining for years his record of debt, right? Even though he had gone past that, but the record still exists to remind anyone who gets onto the internet that Mr. Gonzalez at one point was convicted for debt. And this raises questions of memory and forgetting, right? That the internet does not allow us to forget, that there is a way in which we are haunted by an eternal memory, a hyperthymesia, so to speak, where we are condemned to remember everything. But interestingly enough, to go back to Shakespeare, another image, that the evil that men do lives after them, the good is often interred with their bones. So there's Mr. Gonzalez for you. So I think there's a set of questions here about sentience, about failure, and about memory and forgetfulness, which are central to some of the questions we should be looking at. To get back to the 2 concepts I found very useful to think with from Sheila's work, one is that of co-production, and the other is that of epistemic subsidiarity, and that's what I'll briefly speak about in the time that I have. This is a bit like watching the, like the population clock or something. There's a clock ticking in front of me, and I think at the end of it, something's going to happen, so it's making me very nervous. So co-production. So the idea of thinking natural and social orders as being produced together. And to use Sheila's words, the ways in which we know and represent the world are inseparable from the ways in which we choose to live in it. So what do we do with this idea? And how do we think about co-production from the Global South and the ideas that come from the Global South, and those two are the things that I'm going to be speaking about. So way back in 2014, the Spanish national oil company, Repsol, teamed together with IBM Watson. IBM Watson is responsible for artificial intelligence. And they were going to leverage cognitive technology to transform the oil and gas industry. What this means is that they wanted to extract every last drop of oil from the earth. And this was, in the contemporary parlance, smart decisions, smart tools, many of these phrases which actually make us gag, so to speak. And what was at the heart of this was hastening the degradation and the exhaustion of the planet. So the question we have to ask is, what intelligence is at work here? Right? What is the form of intelligence that results in this kind of devastation? Should we call it intelligence at all? And James Bridle has called this a very specific kind of intelligence. He calls this corporate intelligence. So very often when we are talking about artificial intelligence and its uses, we're talking about a corporate intelligence. Yesterday we had a discussion where Achille suggested we should be using the idea of synthetic intelligence, of the human and the animal, and the human and the natural world producing an intelligence together. Because the idea of artificial intelligence is, of course, very narcissistic. It's that which is not human. We represent the acme of intelligence, presumably, considering the devastation we have wrought on the world. So what are the other ways of thinking about intelligence? That is the question before us. So the biological and behavioral sciences and indigenous forms of knowing have reminded us and taught us ways of moving away from narratives of avarice to narratives of thriving. And that's something that we need to think about, and particularly our entanglement as humans with the more than human world. And how do we think with that? And this leads us to indigenous forms of knowledge where this entanglement is central to the thinking about the world. And so the question of building an artificial intelligence, within quotation marks, a synthetic intelligence, call it what you will, how do we engage with octopuses, fungi, forests, the wonderful work that Melvin Sheldrake has written on fungi, or Suzanne Simard on forests, other forms of intelligence that coexist alongside the human. So, for example, one example from James Bridle's wonderful book is that of the white cypress tree in California. Whole trees have migrated over 100 kilometers over 30 years to escape the devastation, right, that is being wrought on them. And this is not something out of the Lord of the Rings and the movement of the Ents. This is something that has actually been happening over generations. So how do we rethink intelligence beyond the human, beyond that artificial, narcissistic divide between the human and the artificial? The last question in the 2 minutes that I have, the question of co-production, and this is central to the work that I do. How do we think about the question of co-production in a more empirical sense, and the question of theory? What do we do with this idea of knowledge from the global south? Sheila uses the phrase epistemic subsidiarity. It's a device used in systems of constitutional governance in order to protect spaces for the expression of local values and local autonomy. So how do we think about forms of knowledge which are not to be subordinated to these larger hegemonic forms of knowledge? And in many senses, this is a question that is a vital question when we regard the political economy of academia and the hegemony of Euro-American ideas, paradigms, and so on. And how do we generate theory now in the present circumstance that we are, call it Anthropocene, Capitalocene, climate Caucasianism, Plantationocene, whatever the phrase that one may use. And the feminist art historian Maja has asked us to think with the idea of trans-hemispheric conversations, because in a period of global warming where we all stand as humanity at the precipice, these distinctions of global south, global north, first world, third world, when the waters rise, we shall drown as one, right? And so when you think about that, we need to think about trans-hemispheric conversations. And so this question throws into crisis both the idea of Anthropocene as well as the global south. So how do we think with concepts that do not arise from a separation or a disjuncture with nature? And a number of younger anthropologists in India, for example, Radhika Govindarajan, who's written this book called Animal Intimacies, in the central Himalayas, look at the relation of human beings with animals like cows, goats, bears, monkeys, and the production of a certain form of knowledge, which is about agriculture, about living together. And my dear friend Chakanetsa Mahunga, who is at MIT, who works in STS, and who has this idea of the professoriate of the hunt, where he speaks to STS from the practices of hunting in Zimbabwe. And these hunters who create a knowledge of the world through an observation of animal behavior, of the movement of the stars, the study of grasses, and so on. So here we are trying to move towards a genuine conversation of two kinds, a genuine conversation between humans and nature, and a genuine conversation that can take on board the fact that there are these hierarchical divisions of the global north and the global south, where those conversations need to happen on a more equal footing. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dilip. The last speaker is Alf, after which we'll set up the time for, let's say, 25 minutes of exchanges among yourself before we open it up to the public. So Alf, it's your turn.
All right, thanks Achille, and thanks to the Holberg Prize for bringing us all together for these conversations. Now I thought I'd use the opportunity that my invitation to participate in these conversations offers to try and put forward some reflections on the pluralization of epistemic frameworks that I've been concerned with in some of my own work, where I've been preoccupied with understanding the nature of theoretical knowledge production in and through the collective action of social movements, some of which have been engaged in particularly high-stakes conflicts over the use and control of natural resources. And the point of departure for my reflections is the reference that's made in the abstract for this session to critiques of the hegemonies of Western social thought and its racialized and gendered genealogies, the imperative of decolonization, and the troubled epistemic relations between the northern and southern hemispheres of the world system. Now, I must start by acknowledging that I happen to be someone who once authored an opinion piece that was titled "The Unbearable Whiteness of the Holberg Prize." And I also responded to the rejoinder from the then director of the Holberg Prize, who was my former HOD, with another piece that was called #HolbergSoWhite. So I'm very happy to see the concerns that I tried to raise some years back figure so centrally in the conversations that we're having today. However, I also want to propose that the pursuit of epistemic justice must and should be conducted on a more sophisticated basis than a simple counterposing of the northern and southern hemispheres as dominant and subaltern positions in a binary relation of epistemic power. That's not to say that the hegemonies of Western social thought do not constitute a foundational and deeply problematic asymmetry in the academy. It is, however, to say that a singular focus on this one power structure or on the geographical provenance of particular bodies of theoretical knowledge does have the potential to obfuscate more complex power dynamics, and that any presumption that it makes sense to conceive of the northern and southern hemispheres of the world system as watertight epistemic compartments not only robs us of the possibility of dialogues that we sorely need in our turbulent conjuncture, but also erases from view insurgent forms of knowledge production that have crisscrossed north-south boundaries with great agility and capaciousness ever since this boundary was forged in the furnace of the colonial encounter. So in preparing for today's event, I found myself zooming in on Prof. Jasanoff's definition of the co-production of science and society as being moored in a refusal of the boundary between what we take the state of the world to be and how we wish to live in it. Whereas Prof. Jasanoff's conception of co-production is located in the field of science and technology studies, which is a field that I claim no special familiarity with at all, I found the focus on the refusal of the distinction between the is and the ought to be to resonate in certain ways with the fundamental characteristic of knowledge production that I've explored in my own research. And the argument that I've tried to articulate in that work is quite straightforward. Firstly, I propose that theory is not strictly or only a specialized form of scholarly expert knowledge. On the contrary, historically oppressed groups, be it colonized people, women, people of color, workers, queer folks, indigenous communities, and so on, have always and everywhere been involved in the production of theory through collective learning in social movements. And as academics, we should of course be very well aware of that, given that some of the most important theorizations of the core power relations that underpin the modern world system have been spawned by and developed in and through social movements that have set out to challenge and transform those power relations. The examples abound, whether we're talking about post-colonial theory, whether we're talking about the Black radical tradition, Marxism, feminism, queer theory, you could go on and on. In short, what I'm saying is that social movements that change the world also change how we know and understand the world. Secondly, I propose that insurgent social theory, which is what I call the outcomes of these knowledge-making practices, is qualitatively different in nature from conventional scholastic theory, whereas the latter is mainly concerned with explaining the organization of the world as it is. Insurgent social theory is geared towards the achievement of emancipatory transformation. And what I mean by that, again, to specify, is quite simply that the fundamental question for insurgent social theory is not simply why is the world the way it is, but also, and more importantly, what ought the world to be like and how can we make it so. Now, if we acknowledge, and here I'm using Prof. Jasanoff's phrase from one of her recent articles, that transformation is the mandate for humanity's future and that transformation by its very nature must run deep, then there's every reason to turn towards insurgent social theory as a resource for thinking through what transformation must look like in a world which has passed the point at which it would have been possible to limit the climate crisis to a 1.5 degree increase in the intensity of global heating. If we want to harness this resource, there's a certain way also in which we will be compelled to think beyond simple north-south dichotomies and binaries. This is so because we are harnessing epistemic gains made in and through incomplete struggles for emancipation that straddle the north-south axis of the world system as a result of the fact that different bodies of insurgent social theory have traveled between and cross-fertilized movements and struggles regardless of provenance and identity. In no small part, of course, because these movements recognized the interconnections between their struggles. Linked to this is also the need to work with a certain ethic of engagement in which we avoid those very tedious and tiresome debates in which one form of insurgent social theory is posited as being inherently superior to other forms of insurgent social theory. Far too often, that particular wasteful exercise is predicated on the assumption that one particular power structure is more important than others. This assumption is, of course, flawed, as it fails to grasp that power structures always interlock in concrete circumstances of exploitation and oppression, and that emancipatory struggles consequently cannot be conducted based on an abstract and singular uniformity of interests. Instead, working towards what I call insurgent epistemic gain, that is, the crafting of theoretical knowledge that's more effective in advancing emancipatory transformation, by necessity entails making space for dialogues between bodies of theory produced in and through movements that were and are closely entangled with each other. Using Stuart Hall's wise words, and his words are always wise, the making of insurgent epistemic gains depends on our willingness and our ability to embrace the mess. But are these reflections relevant at all to a conjuncture in which the prospects for sustainable planetary futures are, for very good reasons, in serious and ever-deepening doubt? Well, I think they are, and I'll close off with a very brief and no doubt inadequate explanation as to why I believe that to be the case. So I consider the crisis of anthropogenic climate change that we currently confront being essentially a product, as Sheila alluded to in her initial intervention, a product of the human reorganization of nature and nature-society relations under capitalism, and that's an analytical distinction, not an ontological dualism that I'm proposing when I use that formulation. And I think that when we make this argument, or if we accept that argument, we need to simultaneously acknowledge that the human reorganization of nature also tends to be a way of physically establishing social inequalities. And viewed from that particular vantage point, it's not possible to consider the climate crisis separately from the modern world system and the classed and racialized and gendered power structures that sustain it. Moreover, and conversely, the flip side of that is that we cannot understand these social power structures as being in any meaningful way separate from the asymmetrical global resource flows, ecological unequal exchange relations, and ecological distribution conflicts, including conflicts over the skewed distribution of carbon emissions and also of the biospheric and meteorological consequences of those emissions that are intrinsic to that world system. Finally, we cannot understand the nature and depth of the transformations that will be needed to address this crisis unless we work, I think, with the insurgent theoretical knowledge generated by social movements in struggle against inequalities that are simultaneously social, gendered, racial, and environmental, and for forms of justice that similarly must be social, gendered, racial, and environmental. And I'll close off there.
Okay, you still had 15 seconds, but we're happy to take them. So, first of all, I would like to thank you all individually for what seems to me to have been a very high level and sophisticated exchange. We started from a number of notions, concepts, and ideas put forward by Sheila. And each of you has made an effort to engage with them and make them resonate somewhat in your own work. The result has been, at least for me, pretty spectacular set of interventions. I'm not going to try to summarize at all. Second, it seems to me that in so doing, you have each in his or her own way mapped a kind of convergence. It's pretty easy to see from the moment Sheila spoke to the conclusion, Alf, you have just drawn a moment ago. So I would like to spend the next 25 minutes deepening somewhat the exchange that you started. And I would like to start by asking you a malicious question. The convergences we see, where are the oppositions? What is it that you have heard which you fundamentally disagree with? Are there issues in what we have heard which you would like to contest or in any case engage with a bit more openly than in the polite manner in which you did a moment ago? So who would like to start? Dilip seems to be eager to say something. So maybe we'll start with Dilip.
I was trying to restrain my inner Gandhian self, this invitation to fight with colleagues. No, but I think one of the questions that has been bothering me is that central to all our thinking is this question of we can't think the world without human beings. And that is a problem, right? Because that is the center of our anthropocentric discourse. And so I have been trying to read more about whales and mushrooms and trees and so on, not so much along the lines of can the subaltern speak, right? I mean, can the snail speak? But the question really is that if we think about the ways in which we have qualified the Anthropocene by saying, look, we need to look at the Capitalocene, or we need to look at the Plantationocene, and so on. We are again bringing back the whole question to the human and forms of hierarchy, forms of violence, forms of inequality generated by the human. And here the recent work of Dipesh Chakravarty I found quite useful, where he tries to think in terms of the time of the human and the time of the planet. And these are two different times. One is on an extraordinary scale, so that even when we cease to exist, all of these problems of the increased carbon and so on will be wiped out in a few million years, right? The Earth will correct itself. And so central to our theorizing should not be to wrap back this whole issue back into our Marxist and other forms of understanding that we already have, but to think what new theory can we come up with where we are able to reckon with times and forms of life that the social sciences in its committed anthropocentrism has not engaged with.
Well, Achille, you put forward a provocation, and in a way, all of my colleagues have done the same sort of thing. But let me begin by saying I myself am an unabashed humanist. I think that the best way we can live on Earth is in fact to give way to certain of the tendencies of the human that I continue to care deeply about. The capacity to form relationships, to be able to to be put in situations where one has never met very distinguished colleagues that one may know of from the literature, and for the energizing possibility of actually having face-to-face conversations that have an immediacy to them, an unexpectedness to them, where one doesn't know what the next sentence is actually going to bring forward. I mean, these are the capacity of the human to write, to think, to create, to make art, to leave literature, to leave traces in Shakespeare or Tagore, as the case may be, that other people will read. I mean, these are not things that I would give up on. And if those human traits also enable us to understand the world in different ways and to form other sorts of kinships, then more power to it. I mean, so if the Anthropocene is an invitation to enlarge our kinship world as humans, to embrace other things, I don't see why it's necessary to give up the status, the conditions, the capacities of being human in order to bring those things about. And I completely resonate with Alf's call for a more inclusive in terms of perspectival positions racially, in terms of gender and indigenous knowledge, which Lindsay, you spoke about. I mean, that all to me is perfectly consistent with an enlarged and more generous conception of what humanism is all about. And I don't want to give up on that. In fact, I think that that would be quite a dangerous step. And one thing that I've noticed is that the embrace of the Anthropocene has been quite pronounced among male social theorists for reasons that, to me, are a little bit suspect, because it again reinscribes a kind of tendency towards scientization, towards universalism, towards thinking in categories that are somehow overriding. And my work has been about rediscovering and recovering the local and the particular and the situated in contexts where people have forgotten that those things exist. So if there's one dimension on which I would love to engage my co-panelists today, it's in thinking more about institutions, because that is a level of organization that is not the same as the nation state. It certainly is not the binary of global north and global south, which I think all of us rightly reject to various degrees. It's not even, Alf, with due respect to your extremely eloquent intervention, at the level of social movements, because having worked with people from social movements, I recognize the immense barriers that people confront in taking their insurgent imaginations and using them in ways where the kind of transformative potential that all of us wish to unlock, would be felt as transformational. And I'll tell you about two institutions that strike me as definitely, worth our critical gaze and stance, one that we all know well, which is universities, which are, after all, one of the primary custodians of knowledge making. And yesterday, in one of the casual conversations, somebody was mentioning a true fact that universities are among the oldest institutions, along with religious foundations, that we have created in the world. I mean, some of our oldest universities are now 1,000+ years old. So this is a very ancient, very respected form of institution that seems to be in all kinds of different ways marginalizing transformative thought. And it's extremely difficult, I know from my own experience, trying to stand up for a field that I think is essential, that, we begin to take seriously what the job of these particular institutions is, and why, in spite of all the lip service to interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, whatever, we don't actually budge in ways that seem to me would open the door to other ways of thinking. So why are the environmental social justice movements that you're talking about doomed to stay within themselves? I mean, where are the innovative combinations of cross-sectoral dialogue that universities are in some way trying to foster? University-industry relations, that has become a buzzword. So we do very well with the private sector because they bring us money. But university civil society relations are not talked about at all the same way or fostered in the same way. Or if they are, it's in terms of a sort of imagined thing called impact. So we're supposed to have impact on legislation or whatever. And I think that is a sort of problematic character. The other institution, and I won't say much about this because I've written more words than I care to count, is law. But legal institutions have an enormous role in channeling discourse. I once, together with a group of very prized colleagues, tried to raise in the World Trade Organization an argument about risk that I felt was both true to the social science of the time and still today, and also respectful of a degree of localism in our knowing and understanding ecosystems that I felt was worth promoting. And this was the debate around GMOs that the US and Argentina and other grain-producing countries, the complaint that they brought against the European Union for blocking GMOs. And we tried to make the argument that some forms of local knowledge and local understanding should count every bit as importantly as so-called scientific risk assessment in establishing the, quote, safety, unquote, of GMOs. And that discussion did not actually lead to a transformative change, although I think it played its part in developing a set of policies that actually encourage subsidiarity a bit more than before. But the experience that we had in that process of trying to bring a social science sanctioned insurgent worldview about GMOs to the uppermost levels of decision making, that was to some extent intellectually and politically quite transformative for me, because I understood in my own flesh, as it were, just how difficult it is, and yet how exhilarating it is. So there we were, a group of 5 intellectuals, in a borrowed room from the Lancaster Friends Center, having tea and cookies that we ourselves brought along, and we were trying to make an argument. But, I think that those kinds of examples really point to the need to look at structure, even while we're celebrating agency, which I think all 4 of us, and Achille as well, would like to do. I mean, where does agency bump up against structure? And that is one of those places that I think are an eternal problem for the social sciences. I mean, how can you reconfigure structure to create spaces of agency? And I don't know how you do that without analyzing institutions.
Okay, this is very, very clear. Lesley, and then Alf.
What a wonderful set of interventions. Thank you. So many points to think with, but I want to come back to constitutionality, law institutions. I think one of the key interventions that the social sciences can and should be making is going back to rethink the inherited concepts that came with modernity, coloniality. You began mentioning a couple of them. Fact and value, nature, society, isn't aught. One of the ones that I would add to that is time and space. And that might sound terribly abstract, but bear with me. The separation of time and space, I think, is central to capitalism. You know, the creation of terra nullius, to erase history. We're all very familiar with that set of discourses. But that separation continues in so many ways, and it makes us tellers of objects rather than tellers of stories. And I think that objectified knowledge is one of the key problems of the ways in which we've inherited knowledge production in the universities, which Césaire mentioned when he wrote Colonization, is thingification in his book Discourse on Colonialism. Ben Okri picks this up, his recent book, title escapes me right now, but his recent book, which is a set of beautiful interventions around thinking with the planetary and with climate, where he brings his essay making and his novelistic skills together. He's beautifully bringing together the capacity to respond to the world by telling stories. And I think stories do a number of things. They bring us both to thinking and feeling, and they bring us back to time and temporalities. And this matters. I mean, I think we're all familiar with the magic and the miracle of looking up into the sky and knowing that you're seeing in the stars vastly different temporalities. You know, that star might be 4 billion years away, and therefore, you know, we're looking at 4 billion years ago. The star might be, 200 million years ago, or light years away. And so we're looking at very different temporalities in the night sky, but we're also looking at very different temporalities in landscapes. And I think one of the beauties of indigenous ways of knowing landscapes is the capacity to tell stories that understand relations and processes. This brings us back to Glissant and Césaire and the Caribbean interventions that you've written about, Achille. The difference between an approach to the world in being and an approach in relation. A small example, I had a long conversation the other day with a local conservationist in one of the areas that I am doing some research in. And he had said that when rain falls, it takes 30 years to travel through the aquifer from the mountains of Constantia to pop up in Zeekoevlei, which is just east of Muizenberg. 30 years. So, the rain that fell, last month my 21-year-old son will be 51 when those raindrops pop up in that lake. It's an extraordinary time frame. And then he said to me, so what was so interesting is about the rainfall we had a few weeks ago, when we had those heavy, heavy floods. He said the lake didn't come up as high as it would have done. And the reason for that is that 20 years ago, not 20 years, that a couple of years ago there was this drought in Cape Town, so the aquifer was low. But previously, when that lake has been very high, the reason for that was that there was a pulse of water that had traveled over a period of 20 years from a very high level of rainfall 20 years before. And that was the reason that this year the lake did not cross a particular road, didn't flood that road. These are extraordinary, the different temporalities that are at play in a single landscape. And I think one of the things that we talk about insurgent knowledges and the connections of insurgent knowledges globally is the determination to tell stories of relations, stories of connection, stories of humanizing, and those are also stories that connect us with temporalities. And I think local knowledge understands temporalities in ways that are inevident in many of the ways that, for example, sustainability sciences are being done where there's very, very simplistic notions of past, present, and future, and we're not understanding the absolute multiplicity of temporalities that are entangled in any particular landscape at any particular moment. So I think the most important thing for us to be doing in our universities is really challenging the inheritance of concepts with which we are making the world, because those are making it difficult for us to see how to fix things. I could carry on with lots more examples, but I'll stop there.
Maja, just a brief response, I think, to what Dilip said, which is that whereas I recognize the intellectual fascination with larger temporal scales and so on and so forth, I have to also admit to a slight discomfort with it, and it comes from a conversation I had once with a friend of mine who's at Harvard, and we were discussing certain takes on sort of the Anthropocene, deep time, and all of that, and he leaned back and he said, "Yeah, but Alf, this is Whitey on the moon theory." And what he meant by that was that he was concerned, and so am I, that it's a form of theory and a theoretical advance that enables you to see a lot and to gain a wider gaze. But his concern was, and of course he was riffing on Gil Scott-Heron, right? And his lyric in the aftermath of Neil Armstrong's moon landing, that I can pay no doctor bill, but Whitey on the moon. A rat done bit my sister Nell, but Whitey on the moon. So it's a form of advance that's divorced from very immediate and pressing concerns. So I'm concerned then that if we extend out so widely that we somehow see everything almost kaleidoscopically, we also fail to be able to see things that are urgent and that really matter and that are ultimately very pressing human concerns. And I'm not sure I'm prepared to go there. And that relates to sharing a position that Sheila also adopts, which is that I'm adamantly a humanist. And I'm concerned that we too often reduce humanism to a mastodon, that it simply is enlightenment knowledge of the kind that we like to take a stick to and beat. But it isn't that. It's much more, right? What we reckon humanism to be, what we understand humanism to be. And it's a constant object of struggle, and its meanings are contested, not least through the collective action of social movements who constantly challenge the meaning of what it is to be human, also in relation to nature. So that for me is very significant. And then it comes to the interpellation from Sheila, and I'm sorry to disappoint in a sense, because there's nothing in what Sheila says that I disagree with. I recognize the importance of institutions, and I think it's really interesting that you brought up universities and law. Only because as a social movement, as a scholar of social movements, when I see an institution, I look for the imprint of social movements upon those institutions. Because I tend to think of institutions, much as I think of social structures, as the sediment of struggles over what these things were supposed to be, how they were supposed to be given form, shape, direction, and all of that. I mean, we're sitting in, a university in South Africa, which is testament to all that, right? So for me, it's important to not de-link the university as an institution, just like it's important to not de-link law. Yes, the courts are important. Yes, legal texts are important, but law is also a battleground, of course. And this is very much the case when you're dealing with, in the field that I started out in, which was the study of environmental social movements. So much of what a movement like the Narmada Bachao Andolan did, for example, was to mobilize around law, to mobilize for changes in law, to craft what I call counter expertise against the state's monolithic expertise that enabled them to justify a huge dam project which would erase indigenous livelihoods. And they lost that struggle. And there is a point here, if you're worried now, there's a point at the end of this. They lost that battle, but nevertheless they changed institutions, because the way in which their struggle changed in terms of debate, and this was basically a debate about whether or not indigenous people had a right to resettlement and rehabilitation in the event of what's called development-induced displacement in policy terms, but was really just accumulation by dispossession. They changed the terms of debate on that, and new laws have been put in place in India that reflect some of their struggle, albeit moderated. So again, for me, institutions, yes, I entirely agree. It's just that when I look at institutions, I'm keen to see where social movements have dented them and given them shape and given form to them. And I think it's really important for us then, again, as like say academics, to bear that in mind in our own work and look for those connections. So I think that's really it. There's no significant. I don't think there's a significant disagreement there.
Sure, they are not significant. Anyway, Dilip, and then I'll go back to Sheila.
But I'd still like to return to what I was trying to formulate. The question is, how can we think differently? And I think there is an exigent necessity for us to think differently with the world that is in front of us. There is a kind of training that we've had as social scientists which allows us to explain and then explain away, or to believe in some kind of a belief in, regardless of our critiques of it, a belief in the high road to progress, that better institutions, better laws, better thing will eventually help us to resolve the problem. And I don't think we should work with the false binary of that which is before us and that which is on a larger scale of time, because all said and done, there is the academic conceit of the work that we do. As Gandhi said, it does not wipe away the widow's tear nor put a morsel in the mouth of the orphan. So I'm very clear as to what my academic work actually does. So if one is to move beyond this androcentric, to use your phrase, anthropocentric conceit, how are we to think about the world without us, which is a crucial question? Because to give you an example, and this is something, David Attenborough is a person whose work I've watched from the age of 13 or 14. And he has an entire series on the world without humans and how the world restores itself. And one of the episodes, which is my favorite episode, is set in Chernobyl, where we all know what happened in 1986. A certain kind of hubris results in a nuclear accident, leading to that entire area becoming uninhabitable by humans. But that's the best thing that's happened to Chernobyl. All forms of life are thriving. Extinct species have come back. The Przewalski's horse, which was deemed extinct, now they're galloping across the plain. Wolves have returned. Insects have multiplied. So I think that's also something to think about as a conceptual horizon, right? That we need to think about this world and its existence beyond us. Our social sciences commits us to thinking the world with us at the center of our understanding. And there's very little work that we do that is of any use to, I would say, human or insect. So I'll stop there. I mean, you wanted a provocation, you have it.
Sheila?
Well, Dilip, I won't trouble you by saying what is the subject of the think in your delightful provocation, in a way. Sebald wrote this essay that some of you may be familiar with on the natural history of disaster, where, destruction, which, in which he wondered about why German authors had been so reluctant to write about the aftermath of the Second World War, and the essay was misinterpreted in various ways, but he has a passage about the return of natural formations after the devastation of the war that reads a little bit like what you just said about Chernobyl, but to whom does it matter? I mean, you know, if one follows this logic out, then there's no reason why we should not engage in nuclear warfare, because after all, the planet will survive and will produce likely new life forms, and besides, if it doesn't, it doesn't. You know, one can be fatalistic about those things as well. Bill McKibben, who is a famous American environmentalist, once wrote that, you know, what if the world is a giant self-cleaning oven, and then with typical American crudeness, and we are the baked-on crud. You know, that was also an invitation to think the world without us. it'd be a less interesting world to me if we were thinking the world without us. I mean, maybe the mosquito would speak and would write things for itself, but let's not forget, I mean, you know, Lesley, your plea for storytelling, scientists also engage in storytelling, and they tell us very powerful stories about how things are. And in fact, the temporality stories that you told are of your conversation with scientists about either stars or rainfall, and they are fascinating. Indeed, they are. But I guess, Alf, I'm concerned about, I mean, first of all, in none of my writing do I take institutions as static, and in all of my writings I take law as an agonistic field in which it is up for grabs. I mean, this is so obvious because law is a place of contestation. It hardly needs to be said, but it's not about ossification only, it's also about changing things. But, you know, then one wonders why some things change and others don't. So if one stands at the Narmada movement, yes, it was an extraordinarily exhilarating mobilization. So was the climate march in New York a number of years ago, and so are, depending on your political orientation, the marches going on around events in the Middle East now. If you stand back a little bit, you said the movement failed, but it changed discourse and it changed practice in the ways in which these things are carried out. But if you stand yet further back, the lifestyles of the rich and famous, shall we say, I mean, urban life and its needs for energy, and the forms of life for which we must generate more energy, those things have stayed the same, whether you're talking about building dams or whether you're talking about building huge, gigantic solar farms or wind farms for that matter. And the more marginalized forms of life that, Lesley, you were talking about are the ones that are deemed sacrificial animals in a sense. So maybe the wins and losses, when we take the whole panel's interests in temporality into account, they themselves have to be situated to some extent, you know, winning over short hauls, long hauls. If we're thinking about planetary futures in the way that Achille wants us to, then, you know, which planetary futures are we thinking about? And, you know, yesterday I was talking about artificial intelligence, which also is a kind of celebratory future making that says we can displace the human altogether. And people react in a funny way differently if you say to them, the robotic universe is what we're looking for, as opposed to this sort of, let's join hands with all of nature universe. They're both extinctions of the human.
Okay, look, we have 35 seconds left, so so we will grant those seconds if you allow me to our very patient audience, which is now invited to interact with the speakers.
In 30 seconds?
No, in 15 minutes. They have 15 minutes. I invite you to, if you have comments or observations, I invite you to make them. It would be good if you ask at least one question to each speaker in the spirit of sharing
Democracy.
and democracy.
It's on. Thanks to the panelists for very interesting presentations and discussion. My question has been inspired by Dilip, what you were saying, the examples you were giving of insects and animals being held to account in the human world. And recently we've seen attempts, and successful attempts in some instances, to give animals, even rivers, for example, the Yamuna in India, human rights. So I'd like to ask the panelists what they think are the possibilities and the limitations and challenges of actually trying to advocate environmental activism by, you know, giving the natural world human rights.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there other questions or comments?
My name is Noah. I've got a short question. Across cultures, before modernity, we have a very rich spiritual heritage, religious heritage. For example, here in Africa, the way there was a respect between humans and nature, it was through religiosity. You find totemism, for example, in some groupings, social groupings, they had respect for an animal. Okay, this animal is our totem, so we can't destroy it, we can't kill it. If such an amazing way of dealing with other species in a religious way was applied now, I think we couldn't observe what is happening now with the current tragedy. So don't you see that secularism has failed, materialism has failed, and that the triumph over climate change requires for us to return to spirituality, to God, to religiosity, to do what one day Professor Achille Mbembe happily astonished me by saying we should decenter the human, because the human rationality is now God. Now we should decenter God and bring back God, so that when God is involved in our public affairs, and then we can respect one another and also respect the rest of other species. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Sheila.
Yeah, so just, I mean, maybe sort of linking from that, but I was just wondering about, because you evoked Radhika's work, Dilip, and I wondered if the point about thinking of the world without humans is to actually push the boundaries of thought, or as it, like I think the way you put it was to think differently, right? Whereas I think of Radhika's work as asking us to feel differently and to think, I mean, obviously all of it is about having, and I guess that's what you're saying as well, about having different relationships with nature, with animals, and different forms of entanglement and interconnection, which could have all sorts of affects, including both love and violence. And actually the book, this is a common colleague's book on India. The book actually ends, of course, by talking about how the Hindu right, in the name of religion, is trying to save animals and protect animals. But in so doing, is weaponizing that, or the safety and the rights of animals, against minorities, and to inflict violence and brutality on minorities. And I wonder if actually, Annie, yours was also, thinking along the same lines, right? So how, in the name of religion, secularism is actually being brutally excised out of the Indian public imagination, and with real brutal, violent consequences. So but back to the thing about, I don't know why you're prioritizing thought and conceptual horizon so much, when we have actually very interesting new work, which is thinking about entanglements and relatedness and affect and embodiment in such a different way. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much. There are two hands here.
Dumelang. Professor Green, I was quite intrigued by your contribution in the conversation, and I'm particularly this idea of storytelling, but for me more so the taking these ideas that are researched and written about in the academy or in the academic spaces to ordinary people, and in thinking through these writings in ordinary language or in language easily consumable for people, and how then people contribute to these stories, and thinking about space and time, these intersectionalities that you were referring to. I haven't yet fully fleshed a question in my head, but I'm curious to hear more, and where can one find more of what you were sharing on, and particularly even the books that you were referencing in your PowerPoint, because I'm more curious in making research accessible to people who would normally not consume this, because you find in oftentimes we go to the communities, take what we can, write, and then leave those people behind without giving back or reporting back to them. So while not having a fully fleshed question, but trying to establish a conversation around that and around people who are not in the space and people who are often at the subjects, I guess, in these researches. So where can one find or access these works of yours and the likes? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One last question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jebe.
Oh.
I'm deeply touched by this phenomenon of Ubuntu and African environmentalism. What do we mean when we talk about that? Now, when I look back how the multinational companies are doing in Africa we had our own philosophy and a way of life, which is mainly based on the biodiversity species. For instance, the multinationals, because they want the underground commodities, so they destroy our biodiversity, which some of them were playing a key role, even in terms of preventing the disasters. Today, we had uncontrollable disasters, and we do not know why. Yet, we're drifting away from these values of Ubuntu, of doing ways in an African way. More focusing on the Western philosophy, Westernization science, which is not bad. But now, where do we find that relationship of ecology and the nature? Are we maybe not shooting ourselves on the feet? Because we as Africans, we had certain ways of getting the information, even oral histories. You know, the ancient people would tell you, when things are like this, the weather is like this, what needs to be done. So, but not today. Nobody speaks about that anymore. Is it not that maybe we need to go back and rethink of what have we abandoned? Thank you.
Okay. And the last question.
Thank you, everybody. I'm interested in not just thinking differently, but expressing differently. I think a lot of artistic thinking and the ability of expressing without words, so through music, through the senses, etc. And I wonder for all of you, what are the real possibilities of this in the work that you do? For the most part, theory is expressed in language that's often written down in a journal behind a paywall in a newspaper, etc. But we're entering into a realm of memes. I mean, most of the stuff that I look at, really, the amount of time I spend on Instagram scrolling through reels versus reading an academic journal is insane. We work in a language that is radically different around theory, and I just wonder what is the possibilities of allowing these different forms of expressions, art, media, music, sound, to think differently.
Okay, thank you very much. I now have to ask my boss, who is Ellen, how it is that we proceed, because we have almost exhausted all the time that was apportioned to us. How many are there? 4? Okay, okay. Can we try 1 minute per person? Okay. Let's start with Sheila, who was very exemplary during her first intervention.
This is your reward.
Well, maybe all of the comments that have been made can be addressed by saying that I'm in favor of anything that expands our imagination about what kinds of things are possible. So granting rights to nature, you know, a lot has been written about this for the last 50 years or so, and people have pointed out all of the problems that in granting rights to nature, you might actually just end up granting more rights to science because the experts will end up speaking about nature. So I don't think the point is so much to give rights to nature as to figure out ways of expanding constrained imaginations, constrained by possibly an overemphasis on the verbal and on thought as opposed to other forms of affective and engagement and entanglement. But at the end of the day, I remain committed to the possibility that we, each of us, are agents of change in some sense, and we should make use of that sense in an unembarrassed way, and I am human.
Sheila. Lesley?
Thank you. You know, I think the problem with allocating rights to rivers and mountains and glaciers is that Woolworths and Pick and Pay have beaten us to it. They are registered as persons in law. And I think that highlights the difficulty of the subject-object divide. By turning everything into a subject, we are not necessarily addressing the problem. The problem is the subject-object divide. So I think that, and again, that gets us back to understanding, to the need for a knowledge that understands relationalities and flows and foregrounds those relations and flows rather than isolating things into objects and taxonomies and then mapping connections between them. You know, material flows, thermodynamics, metabolisms, relations, totems, these are the valuable connections. And knowledge made of connections is a knowledge that defeats us in our extraterrestrial being. You know, we've imagined ourselves as separate from the planet. You know, we've imagined humanity as extraterrestrial. And to reclaim knowledge that is relational and that follows the actual flows takes us out of the subject-object abyss. And to me, that's a more vital way of trying to address the issue that we need to address.
Okay, thanks so much, Lesley. Dilip?
Since you have only 1 minute, Srila, in response to your comment, a resounding yes. Annie, in response to your question, a qualified yes. Then, with regard to the point about the sentimentalization of a pre-colonial past, there were wars in the pre-colonial past even before the colonial powers came, and there was a devastation of nature. So I think we need to have a much more qualified approach to which moves beyond the merely anti-colonial and the presentist. And with regard to art and other things, one of the things that I've been trying to do in my work to decenter the human is that recently I worked with a group of musicians around the story of the giraffe who was transported from Kenya to Beijing, and tried to think with what the giraffe felt on that journey. So there's an opera, for those of you who are interested, it's up online, it's called Giraffe Humming. So I think I've been trying very hard not to be a social scientist.
Okay. Alf?
Yeah, I wanted to respond briefly to the point about endowing nature with rights. And I think my answer would come in this form, that if endowing nature with rights or endowing nature with human rights constituted a guaranteed barrier to the logic of the commodity form, and to the dynamic of commodification, I would be rallying behind it with all possible strength. But the thing is that we know that endowing anything, and human beings in particular, with human rights does not constitute a barrier to commodification. I say that because I think commodification is at the source of our problems. And obviously, as we're seeing in Gaza right now, it's perfectly possible for human beings with a full range of rights to be treated atrociously. And I think the same goes for nature. So it would be false, I think, to elevate that to a silver bullet. And yeah, I'm going to give 7 seconds back to Achille this time.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like us to give a big round of applause to this beautiful panel. We really thank you for what you have given us this afternoon. So it's not yet over. We will take a 20 minutes break, says Ellen. There's coffee right here. The next session will start exactly at 4:05. It will bring together Sheila, who is still with us, and Sizwe Mpofu Walsh from International Relations, and our dear colleague Keith Breckenridge, who is the co-director of WISER. And the theme of the next symposium is democracy and the future of institutions. So thank you very much. Have your cup of coffee and come back here at 4:05.